Okay, well, let's get going. And thank you all for joining this launch event where we're just going to take a few minutes to really share some of the key ideas and concepts within our new book, Aftershocks and Opportunities to Navigating the Next Horizon. The book is launched today, September 28th, and we've had a tremendous response from people around the world who've been buying the book already, or who've been reading about it and seem very interested in how they can engage with the ideas being presented. So let me tell you a little bit more about the book. Many of you will know that last year we put out a call for papers for people to share with us their ideas on the emerging future post the pandemic. And we received well over 100 responses. So we split those into two. The first book, Aftershocks and Opportunities, Scenarios for a Post-Pandemic Future, came out in June of last year. And we had a lot of very strong candidates that we held over, that we thought it would be good to wait a while, see how the pandemic played out, and then work with those authors to refine their content for a year on from when the pandemic started. So we're bringing that out today. And the book has 40 chapters with 37 contributors from 16 countries on 5 continents. And there's a real exploration in the book of the four, well, what I would say are shocks, shifts, risks and opportunities emerging as we both come out of the pandemic, but also we hit the new ideas, the new technologies, the new thinking that is accelerating around us. And the content is really split across 7 sections where the authors lay out their ideas, possible developments, future insights, visions, scenarios, and some fascinating stories of how our world might play out. And let's just have a look at those 7 sections to start off with. So the first of those is around economics and business, and the content there really focuses on a few things. Firstly, trying to explore how the economic landscape might play out with the critical actors involved, the critical dimensions of business, economy, financial markets. And then there's a relatively deep dive into the crypto economy, looking at where it's come from, looking at the kind of assets that sit within it, and the kinds of applications that could emerge. And then we go on to look at, well, how could that impact our world? How could it start to change and disrupt every aspect of the economy and financial markets? Next, there's a sort of very strong focus on where we might be going in business. So looking at how do we start to achieve positive change in our environment and that crossover between the economy and business. What is the role of foresight in business and how can we use it to make better decisions? What are the new organizational and leadership capabilities we require to navigate through this next wave of a rapidly changing reality? And then finally, how do we manage change in that environment? And then a chapter that really crosses over into the rest of the book, but we felt it fitted quite nicely here as well, which is looking at post-pandemic retirement, how economic changes, financial changes, extensions in life expectancy that are coming through radical life extension possibilities, really looking at how those all come together in terms of managing our retirements in the longer term. The next area is around what you call the global economic environment. So this looks at a number of different scenarios for how geopolitics might play out, how the relationship between China, the US and Europe might play out, the nature of conflict and how it might be resolved in that world, and then looking at society itself. What kind of impacts will we face from the disruption and how might they play out in our lives in the coming years, looking at what paths then emerge for individuals, for societies and nations. And then when we pull all that together, what kind of risks and opportunities emerge for us as we start to think about where next? In the regional and national futures section, there's some really powerful and inspiring visions of what it would take to help the economies of the Caribbean, Africa, and the Pacific both recover from the current shock to the system that they've had, and many have been pushed to the brink or even over it. And often we hear the term weak and failing nations. And across these regions, there are a number of examples of nations that are really in need of support. And so this chapter looks at a very positive, or these chapters look at a very positive way that you could rebuild those economies and put them on a platform, not just for survival, but for growth. And in particular, how you give them greater responsibility for their own direction and reduce their reliance on external players, but also then reduce the influence of those external players. And then finally, there's a really interesting chapter that explores how you reboot the countries that have been most ravaged by the pandemic, using Greece as an example case study for that. The next section on society and lifestyle looks at, firstly, this whole idea of the new normal. What could that mean? What could that play out like? We look also at how has the pandemic changed our approach and our personal responsibility for managing our physical well-being. We look at the kinds of generational impacts that have come through or been accelerated or exacerbated by the pandemic, and where the biggest differences might be between the generations operating in society. Well, we may well have 5 different generations in the workplace. We look at some of the legacy issues of social distancing and how they might have a longer term footprint on our behavior. And then finally, there's a fascinating story that kind of dives into this idea of governments taking on a greater level of surveillance through the pandemic and the emergency powers they awarded themselves, and then looking at how the technologies coming through might allow them to have more and more of that, and what are the possible impacts for society if we move into a world where there's high levels of consistent and deep surveillance of our every activity. The 5th section looks at societal futures. So that's looking, sectoral futures. So that's looking at sectors like insurance, healthcare, education, and trying to understand how might they evolve. Looking at agriculture, what are the new technologies coming through that could transform the supply chain? But also, what can we do around sustainable agriculture? What new models can we create? How do we build those bridges between academia, existing farmers, and then new players wanting to come into the sector, but bringing more knowledge and science-led approaches to agriculture? And we also look at things like how the education system might play out. How might the base level models for K-12 education evolve? But also, what are some of the possible futures for university education in the next few years, with some very radical ideas being posited? And then one of the hardest hit industries of all has been travel. And so we actually have the CEO of Visit Greenland laying out a fascinating chapter exploring how travel might evolve and what some of the changes could mean, not just for travel, but also for residency in the future. The 6th section looks at the whole theme of innovation and technology. We look at how advances in science and technology have really pushed our understanding of how we can realize new opportunities, how we can deliver innovation, and have really scaled up the game around how much we can do and how quickly, whether that's in terms of the vaccine development, the way in which we develop personal protective equipment, but also many other areas where we saw incredible collaborations, incredible knowledge sharing, open IP sharing, and a move towards accelerating the innovation agenda. Right now, for example, we're seeing a lot of nations saying they want to bring production back home and build up their capability so they're not so at risk to global shocks. And so we're seeing that innovation play out in a number of ways in terms of how you deliver small footprint innovation, but also global models of innovation. So we explore some of that in the chapter, in the thing. We also look at how do you rethink the innovation agenda to drive a positive outlook and accelerate change at the national level and at the local level, building communities, building regions, and building nations through innovation. We look at the whole notion of virtual presence, as many of you know, The idea of the metaverse is growing in popularity and interest all the time. People starting to understand this idea of living, working, earning our money inside a virtual universe and creating goods and services for people inside that universe. So very interesting chapter exploring some of that and the technologies that enable it. Also looking at how technology can work with communities. How do we bring them together? How do we uplift the capabilities? How do we improve decision making in those communities using technology? And then finally, the last chapter in that section looks at the fine balance between technology and sustainability and how we can use it to maybe enhance and advance some of our goals and our thinking and our practice in driving towards achievement of those sustainable development goals. In the final section of the book, what we've tried to do is to take the ideas and questions and possibilities raised across all the other chapters and turn them into resources for individuals, for decision makers in business, for policy makers in government to say, okay, what can you do with this? What do you really need to focus in on? And we focused on three areas. The first is around what are those dimensions of our world that could create both global opportunities, but on the mirror side, could also create critical risks. So whether that's around climate and the environment and the way in which we're pushing critical planetary boundaries through to the geopolitical world and potentially new models of governance and global governance, through to the risks that if we don't deal with that, economy and financial markets, really looking at how do we manage the shift to a more inclusive and fairer distribution of wealth, through to the other side of that, the risks if we don't get that right, and then the opportunities and risks presented by crypto. We look into technology, in particular in science and technology, and where there's potential to leverage them to maximize the benefit to humanity. But on the other hand, where we face critical risks through uncontrolled development or runaway development, and the risks of not having the right kind of ethical, moral and practical frameworks to guide the development of what's happening. The second piece of this section really taps into the fact that a lot of the chapters have talked about the role of technology in some way or other. So what we've done is a deep dive looking at over 400 technologies and how they might play out over the next 2 years, the next 5 years, and the next 5 to 10 years plus, across 11 different domains of technology, from AI, blockchain and crypto, through to e-commerce, computer architectures, communications, networking technologies, the Internet of Things, and the user interface. And a real exploration there of all sorts of technologies and when they might come through and have an impact. And again, that's really aimed at those trying to plan these things and build their own timelines and trying to understand how do we factor these developments into our strategies and our operating plans. And then the final chapter pulls out many of the insights, many of the questions raised across the book, and consolidates those into 50 questions for individuals, again, for business decision makers and government policy makers, to say, well, what do you need to think about? What are the critical questions you should be asking yourselves? What do we need to understand in order to move forward on this agenda? And so hopefully that makes sense. It's a very rich book. As I say, 40 chapters of fascinating content. Most of the chapters are pretty short, so they're a quick read. 10 minutes, you can probably get through some of the chapters. And I hope you find them of interest. And just to say that as a launch day offer, the book is available on Amazon for the next 24 hours for a mere 99 cents for the ebook version. So I'm going to just take a look to see if we've got any questions in the Q&A field, and we don't. Does anyone have a question that they want to raise about the book or the ideas within it? Feel free to raise your hands or pop a question in the comments box, in the question box. Well, actually, I'm going to spring something on a couple of the people in the chat. I'm going to start with one of my co-editors, Steve Wells, and I'm going to ask Steve to just take a minute or so, if you're there, Steve. If you haven't gone off to make a coffee.
No, I'm here.
To just share with us maybe a couple of thoughts. Do you want to go on video? Can we get you on video? If not,
I'm happy to go on video if you want me on video.
Can I get you on video? Doesn't look like you've got video available. So let's just have you talk. That's fine.
All right.
Why don't you share with us a little bit about the chapters that you contributed to the book?
Well, the basis of the chapters that I contributed to are really around some work that I've been doing since fairly early in 2020, which is exploring where foresight can add real value to organizations, but separate from where it's traditionally used in kind of strategy development type processes. And the one particular area that I've been doing lots of working is understanding how foresight can help the change process, but at the same time, not just focusing on what we might call a traditional change approach, but looking at how we can blend human-centric change with foresight. And that's based on a broad assumption that what we typically do is look to change processes, systems, those kind of things within the organizations. And first of all, we don't actually pay enough attention, arguably, to the human implications of that change, and indeed the impacts on humans within the change. But we also don't really change for the future. We tend to change for the present or the past. So the basic premise here is, why don't we look, when we start the change process, at deploying foresight to help us think about the variable nature of plausible futures? And then when we use that insight to set the change vision, come back later on to say, so how do the change plans that we've established then make sense against these plausible futures? So it's a way of kind of, I mean, it's quite a trite term, I guess, but of future-proofing the change that we're trying to look at. And a lot of the content actually in both the chapters is kind of spun out from that. How do we use foresight within the broader organization? How can we pay more attention to human needs inside organizations, which is where coaching comes in. And coaching has been really interesting, I think, through the pandemic, as was kind of a bit of a halt for coaching as coaches and clients worked out what they needed to do. But I think there's kind of a way through that. So that's one of the things that I'm exploring as well. And as well as that, just this kind of whole bringing together change and foresight piece, and how that perhaps changes how we think about work, the way that we work, and how we actually handle continuous change during work processes. So that's a kind of a whistle-stop tour through both of the chapters that I've contributed to the book.
Thank you, Steve. I've just got a question for you around that. So what do you think are some of the biggest things that have changed around organizations' attitudes towards foresight as a result of the pandemic? How do you see that changing?
I suppose rabbit in headlights comes to mind. That, you know, here's this disruption and oh my God, we managed to do some things to kind of squeak our way through the pandemic, but actually there was a complete lack of preparedness. So I'm sure that's at the heart of what many organizations are doing in re-engaging or engaging for the first time in foresight. And I've found personally that a number of different futurists I've spoken to have come up with the same sort of assumption, you know, that there was an underlying use of foresight through many organizations. Was it growing faster? Was it the same organizations? And then all of a sudden, everyone's now interested. Okay, so how can I use foresight to help my organization think not just about a specific change, but I think importantly, how do we get used to handling the kind of disruptive change that we've seen? So it's not just about using the scenarios, for example, to come up with potential predictions about the future, but it's actually learning the lessons of what those plausible scenarios potentially mean to the organization.
Yeah, fascinating. Funnily enough, in the last couple of weeks, I've heard two different clients use songs to describe the situation. One is the Who song, Won't Get Fooled Again. And there the kind of view is that actually we were blindsided by the pandemic. We just weren't prepared for it. but more importantly, we weren't prepared for the acceleration in change that happened as a result of it, whether it was the adoption of new technologies, working from home, new ways of organizing, and the speed at which competitors were acting and new entrants were coming in. And the second one is an Elvis Costello line, which is history repeats its old conceits. And the point being made there was, there's a real risk that coming out of the pandemic, we sort of forget how much changed. And we go back to treating the future as though it's just a replication of the past. And how do we reset that? How do we build the capacity at every level in the organization to look both outwards and sideways at what might be changing, but also to bring those ideas in and find ways of challenging the internal ecosystem of the organization to avoid it rejecting those ideas.
Yeah. I think language plays a really important part here as well. So I have a particular bee in my bonnet about the use of the word normal, you know, whether it's preceded by new or not, because, you know, normal is only ever what's happening right now. And what we already know from what we see has been happening over the last 12, 18 months is that that's actually full of constant, consistent, radical change. So the use of normal, you know, in new normal, perhaps makes people feel comfortable because they perceive that what we're going back to is something that's very familiar. And that can be, I think, a blocker to actually exploring what might be different and what might be better in a different way in the future.
Absolutely. We've got another one of our contributors here as well. Kapil, I'm going to spring this on you as well. Let me bring you in. Steve, stay here. Let me bring Kapil in as well to the conversation. And there he is. There's Mr. Gupta. And Kapil co-authored with me a couple of the chapters on the crypto economy. So Kapil, do you want to just share with us again a little bit about the content of those chapters and why the crypto economy is becoming so important for organizations and individuals to think about?
Yeah, hi, Rohit. I wasn't expecting this, but thank you. Yeah, I have had my eyes on crypto blockchain since sort of 2012, 2013. And I hadn't paid that much attention over the last few years, but last couple of years, especially the involvement of like the finance within blockchain industry, which is the decentralized finance concept. It got me really interested, and in the chapters, what you and I co-wrote those chapters. What we've tried to bring in there is this concept of how technology and finance in a lot of different sectors, the decentralization is paving the way of how technology might work, to the point that I think even the internet as we know today is going to evolve into Web 3.0, which is going to be decentralized, which reading more and more about web technology is like it was meant to be decentralized, but as everything happens in the world, because of the way our commercial systems are set, these things were very centralized, and now we have the tech, the widespread nature of the web itself has it be that I think we are able to decentralize a lot of these things. So I think going forward, I see from a technology point of view and also financial structures point of view, it'll be interesting how different economies, different cultures will take to this idea of decentralization. And not just from a finance point of view, but a simple thing that, in our political system, the decentralized autonomous organizations, like how will that have an impact on how we just live, how we do things on a day-to-day basis? Obviously, the technology itself and the whole blockchain space and crypto economy is in its infancy right now. There's, it feels like a Wild West. and I think there's no regulation, so those are the things. So in the chapters, we've tried to explain what blockchain technology is, how it, what are the components right now, what are the risks and what are the opportunities, and how over the next few years things might evolve. And it's a really exciting, like I have tech and business background, so it's really exciting for me to really go deeper into this area.
Excellent. I've noticed that another of the contributors, Adam Hawke, is in the room as well. I'll bring Adam in a second, but just one interesting area that we sort of started to explore in the chapters is, on the one hand, we see that crypto and Bitcoin in particular is the fastest growing asset class in history, or the best performing. And then we've seen that we've got to about 300 million users worldwide, which makes it the fastest adoption of a technology in history, with the potential to get to about 1 billion by 2024. How do you think that kind of speed of development, when it butts up against the traditional environment and all the people who are finding lots of reasons to kind of say that crypto is not a good idea, what do you see as that kind of challenge point when those two forces hit each other?
Yeah, interesting question. I feel change is always, when there's a new technology that comes in, I think from a business point of view, from adoption point of view, change always is difficult. I remember, sort of late 90s, 2000s, when I was studying computer science, everyone around me was like, oh, 2000 and the computer science is going to be gone. Why are you doing that? 20 years later, like, where are we right now? I don't think anyone even imagined the scale and the speed of change. So I feel that this is probably a big statement to make, but blockchain is going to play a big part in how the technology is going to evolve in future. I feel that the centralized powers to be will try and make it as difficult as possible, or sort of try and keep that power. And that's going to be the fight, I suppose. How do we make it happen, and how do we make it happen in a regulated way? Because obviously when it comes to finance, there are risks involved. But one thing I see is that predominantly there's a lot of young people who are involved in crypto, a lot of people who are tech savvy and who understand finance, who understand other areas of tech and business, who are driving this. So it's also sort of interesting to look at that they are like the future leaders and future generation that is heavily involved in this technology, which will have a really big impact on how this space is going to evolve. That's just my way of looking at it.
Thank you. Well, Adam is in the room, I hope. Again, hasn't popped off to make a cup of tea. Adam, are you there?
I am, yes. Hello, Rohit. How are you?
Hi. Great to see you. Well, to see your box on the screen. Do you want to just take a couple of minutes to, again, tell us about some of the ideas on your chapter?
Yeah, of course. Obviously, my chapter is around physical activity and how, hopefully, the lockdowns that we've gone through have left a legacy in terms of awareness of the importance of kind of maintaining some kind of physical activity or initiating some kind of physical activity to improve our physical and mental health. My chapter, as a lot of others, are set slightly in the future. So mine was pitched in 2025. And it really came on the back of the fact that we as medical and healthcare professionals and scientists have been, I guess, preaching for decades on the importance of us being physically active. And we've never really had this kind of pedestal to stand on as we did, unfortunately, during the COVID pandemic. and we had an opportunity to really shout from the hilltops, and things like politicians, including the Prime Minister and also the Chief Medical Officer, having a platform every day and talking about, you have 1 hour to go and leave your house and do things, and we suggest you use that for exercise, whether that be walking or lifting up bags of sugar or sand in your house, or even your children, I'd mentioned in the chapter. And people were actually finding it as an escape mechanism from being locked in their houses, particularly those who weren't lucky enough, like myself, to have a garden or some weight training equipment at home. And people started to become really take an initiative and be inventive in terms of how they exercised. And I guess my chapter is, I guess, predicting, and I guess you and others will be able to come back to me in 2025 and see whether my predictions have been correct. But I'm an optimist, and I'm hoping that this has changed our attitudes towards exercise, and that it's becoming much more of a habitual kind of regime within our daily existence. And within my chapter, I talk about, in 5 years' time, I'm hoping that there will be, a change in our kind of mentality about how we do that, and that will take a huge burden off the NHS and other global healthcare providers, and reduce the incidence of things like heart disease, obesity, diabetes, and certain types of cancers, which are kind of the pandemic underneath everything that's going on, and have in some ways been overlooked during this period. And we hope that they won't come back, and that they will slowly dissipate, in my optimistic viewpoint.
Excellent, thank you. I'm conscious that we've just gone over time a little, but Adam, Kapil, Steve, thank you all for joining this impromptu discussion about the book. I would encourage you all to take a look at it. There's a lot of content around the book online on our website. As I say, there is this offer for the next 24 hours to get the book for 99 cents on Amazon. So hopefully you take advantage of it. We'd love to hear your feedback on having read the book, and wish you all a positive future. Thank you.